The restaurant was a cathedral built of glass, gold, and the hushed breath of the elite. It was the kind of establishment where people whispered without realizing they were whispering, where even the air felt expensive, filtered and chilled to a precise temperature that suggested the weather outside was a concern only for the common. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings like frozen explosions, casting a soft amber light over tables that cost more to reserve than most people earned in a month. In this room, silence was the primary currency. Every clink of a silver fork against fine bone china felt like a breach of protocol. Every cough was a violation of the sanctuary. Here, the wealthy came to perform the ultimate act of luxury, pretending the world outside, with its noise and its dirt and its chaos, simply did not exist. Before we dive deeper into this story, click the subscribe button and tell us where you are watching from in the comment section. If this story moves you, share it with someone who loves a good tale. Remember to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story. But the sound cut through everything. It was a sharp, jagged edge in a world of smooth surfaces. A child crying. It wasn't the loud, dramatic tantrum of a spoiled toddler demanding a toy. It was something far more devastating, broken, rhythmic, and hollow. It was the kind of crying that comes from somewhere deep, a subterranean well of grief where words cannot reach and where comfort seems like a foreign concept. It was a sound that didn't care about the hand-pressed Egyptian cotton tablecloths, the vintage imported wine breathing in decanters, or the fact that every influential person in the room was currently engaged in the strenuous task of pretending not to notice. Across the table from the weeping boy sat Mcsame. He was a man whose name had, on more than one occasion, emptied the streets of the city. He was a figure of absolute, chilling stillness. Mcsame never raised his voice because he lived in a reality where he never had to. His silence was more terrifying than any shout. His reputation preceded him like a vast, cold shadow, a dark silhouette that stretched across industries and backrooms. He was the kind of man people crossed the street to avoid, not out of casual dislike, but out of a primal instinct for survival. His business cards were not handed out, they were passed like secrets in windowless rooms. His phone calls made powerful men sweat through their custom-tailored shirts. To the world, he was an immovable object, a force of nature dressed in a charcoal suit. And yet, his son kept crying. Mcsame stared at the boy, his jaw set so tight the bone seemed ready to snap. His hands remained perfectly still on the white cloth, fingers long and pale, like those of a pianist or an assassin. For the first time in his life, the king of the underground was powerless. He was a man who solved problems with a signature or a look, yet he found himself staring at a puzzle he couldn't manipulate. Money couldn't fix this, he had billions. Power couldn't fix this, he owned the city. Fear couldn't fix this, there was no one to threaten. The boy's small, fragile shoulders shook with the force of his gasps. As Mcsame watched, he felt something twist in his chest, a sharp, rusted hook of emotion he had spent years burying under layers of cold pragmatism and necessary cruelty. Everyone in the room knew exactly who Mcsame was. The servers knew, they had huddled in the kitchen earlier, drawing straws with shaking hands to see who would be forced to approach his table. The loser of that draw had turned deathly pale and nearly walked out the back door, ready to quit a high-paying career rather than face that cold, dark gaze. The manager knew. He had personally inspected every grain of salt on the table and every fold in the napkins, sweating through his expensive silk suit until his collar was limp. Even the other customers, the titans of industry and their polished wives, knew. They recognized the bodyguard standing at the perimeter, the deliberate way Mcsame sat with his back to the wall to command the room, and the palpable aura of danger that clung to him like a heavy, expensive cologne. 2 bodyguards stood behind him, positioned like granite statues. They were Jiho and Mingqiu, men who had been forged in the same fires as their employer. Their hands were clasped in front of them, their eyes moving in rhythmic, mechanical arcs, scanning for threats that didn't exist in this 5-star bubble. They were trained to handle high-velocity rounds and knife-wielding assassins. They were trained to protect their boss at any cost. And yet, none of their training mattered to the small boy shaking in his chair. They could stop a bullet, but they couldn't stop a sob. Mcsame finally leaned forward. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, yet it carried the weight of a divine decree. It was a voice that had ended careers and started wars. "Enough," he said quietly. The word was meant to be an anchor, but the boy only cried harder, the sound escalating into a frantic, breathless wail. Jiho, the elder guard who had served Mcsame for 7 years, moved with a sudden, stiff grace. He placed a luxury toy on the table, a sleek, limited-edition remote-controlled car that cost more than a family's monthly rent. It sat there, a masterpiece of plastic and engineering, gleaming under the chandeliers. The boy didn't even glance at it. Mingqiu, sensing the rising tension, signaled a waiter to bring a plate of dessert. It was an elaborate chocolate creation, a sprawling landscape of cocoa and gold leaf that the head chef had spent an hour perfecting. It was beautiful, edible art. The boy pushed it away with trembling hands, the plate sliding dangerously close to the edge of the table. Then he buried his face in his small arms, his whole body convulsing with a grief that seemed too large for such a tiny frame. The crying echoed, bouncing off the polished marble and the high ceilings, making the silence of the other patrons feel brittle. Slowly, a new feeling began to ripple through the room, irritation. It didn't come from Yongsun. His face remained a perfect, neutral mask, a stone visage he had perfected over decades of deception. The irritation came from the others. The elite were being inconvenienced. Their expensive peace was being shattered by a child's lack of discipline. Yet no one dared to complain. No one dared even glance too long in their direction, fearing that a stray look might be interpreted as a challenge. The tension built like steam in a sealed pipe, thick, hot, and suffocating. A businessman 3 tables away shifted his weight, his heavy gold watch catching the light as he checked the time, his lips thinned in a silent scowl. A younger couple in the corner exchanged a look of pure misery, their romantic evening spoiled, but the protest died in their throats the moment they saw the cold profile of the man at the head of the boys' table. The manager hovered near the kitchen door, his face a shade of gray that matched the shadows. He wrung his hands together, his mind a chaotic battlefield. Was intervening an act of brave customer service, or was it a suicidal mistake? Then there was Tara. Tara had worked in this gilded cage long enough to learn the one rule that mattered more than all the others combined: never stand out. In a place where the customers were the stars, the staff were supposed to be ghosts, efficient, invisible, and silent. This was doubly true when it came to men like Yongsun. Her training, her instincts, and her fear all shouted the same thing: keep your head down. Do your job. Collect your tips. Go home. Don't make eye contact with the dangerous tables. Don't ask questions. Don't exist in their peripheral vision. She had learned that rule through the harsh reality of experience. She had seen girls fired for accidentally interrupting a billionaire's punchline. She had seen men escorted out for refilling a glass while a sensitive deal was being discussed. She knew that in this world, to be noticed was to be at risk. But as she passed the table with a crystal water pitcher, moving with the practiced, swift gait of a professional, she noticed something that stopped her heart. She wasn't looking at the tears she'd seen children cry before. It was the boy's eyes. Between the gasps and the sobs, his eyes were searching. They were drifting across the room, past the guards and the gold, reaching for something that wasn't on the menu. He looked at a woman 3 tables over who was gently holding her daughter's hand, guiding her as she cut a piece of chicken. He looked at a mother near the window who was absent-mindedly brushing crumbs off her son's velvet jacket with a look of casual, effortless affection. To every maternal gesture in the room, the boy's gaze followed like a moth to a flame, desperate, aching, and starved. Tara froze. The weight of the water pitcher seemed to triple. She recognized that look. She knew that specific brand of empty searching, that hollow hunger for a ghost. She had seen that same expression in her own mirror the year her mother died. She had been 8 years old, standing in a world that had suddenly become too big, too cold, and too permanent in its cruelty. She knew what it felt like to be surrounded by luxury and yet be dying of thirst for a single warm touch. "Don't go near them," a voice hissed. The manager had appeared at her elbow, his hand gripping her forearm with white-knuckled panic. "Tara, I'm serious. That's Yongsun. Do you understand what that means for you? For this restaurant?" Tara nodded slowly, but her eyes never left the boy. She understood. She knew Yongsun wasn't just a wealthy man. He was a shark in a suit. He was the kind of danger that the news media whispered about but never dared to name. He was the kind of man who made problems, and people, disappear without a trace. But her feet didn't move away. They moved closer. The guards reacted instantly. It was as if a silent alarm had tripped. Jiho shifted his weight, his hand moving a fraction of an inch closer to the lapel of his jacket where his holster sat. Mingqiu stepped into her path, his massive frame creating a physical wall of muscle and implicit threat. Yongsun lifted his gaze. The restaurant, which Tara thought couldn't get any quieter, somehow dropped into a deeper, more profound silence. His eyes were dark pools of ink, unreadable and ancient. They were eyes that had seen things Tara didn't want to imagine, the kinds of things that happened in the dark, away from the chandeliers. "I'm sorry," Tara said. Her voice was thin but it didn't break. Extra napkins. She held up a small stack of white linens she had snatched from the service station. It was a flimsy excuse, a transparent lie that they both knew was a lie. A man like Yong-sun didn't need napkins. He needed a miracle. Yong-sun studied with her. He looked at her not as a server but as a person, his gaze calculating and sharp. But there was no anger there. To her surprise, she saw only exhaustion. A deep, bone-weary fatigue that came from fighting a war that money couldn't win. He looked like a king who had realized his crown was made of lead. "Go ahead," he said finally. His voice was tired. Tara stepped past the guard and placed the napkins on the table with hands that shook despite her best efforts. She was acutely aware of the manager's horrified stare from the kitchen, of the guard's heavy presence behind her, and of the way every patron in the room was watching her like they were waiting for a car crash. The boy cried again, a sharp, sudden spike of distress that was so pure and so agonizing it cut through Tara's professional armor. And then, without planning it, without weighing the consequences to her job or her safety, Tara knelt beside him on the plush carpet. A collective gasp rippled through the dining room. The manager made a small, strangled sound in his throat. Jiho actually took a full step forward, his hand reaching for his weapon, his eyes looking to Yong-sun for the order to remove the threat. Yong-sun didn't give it. A nearly imperceptible shake of his head stopped the guard in his tracks. Tara didn't look at the guards. She didn't look at the manager. She didn't look at the sea of shocked faces. She looked only at the child. She reached out not to touch him, not yet, but to be in his space. She spoke quietly, her voice gentle but carrying a strange, unshakable certainty. "He's not hungry," she said. The statement was a bolt of lightning. Yong-sun stiffened, every muscle in his frame vibrating with sudden tension. The guards exchanged a look of pure confusion. The manager looked as though he might actually faint. In this room no one spoke back to Yong-sun. No one corrected him. No one dared to tell him what his own son needed. Tara swallowed the lump in her throat. Her heart was hammering against her ribs so loudly she was certain the boy could hear it. She looked at Yong-sun, meeting those terrifying dark eyes with a courage she didn't know she possessed. "He just needs a mom," she said. The words were only 7 in number, but they carried the force of a landslide. Silence followed, the kind of silence that feels heavy and physical, pressing down on the lungs until the air becomes hard to draw. It was the silence that exists in the heart of a storm, the quiet before an explosion that changes the landscape forever. The boy's sobbing slowed. He let out a long, shuddering hiccup and finally lifted his head from his arms. He looked at Tara with wide, wet eyes that were filled with something fragile, desperate, and, for the first time that night, hopeful. Yong-sun's fingers trembled on the table. It was the first uncontrolled movement any of his associates had ever seen him make. His jaw clenched and for a fleeting moment, his eyes closed. In that heartbeat, the mask of the cold, absolute ruler cracked. 1 sentence. 7 words. And the vault he had built around his heart 3 years ago, on the day he had buried his wife, began to crumble. Yong-sun wasn't in the restaurant anymore. He wasn't the man whose name emptied the streets. He was just a father, standing in the wreckage of a life that power couldn't protect, looking at a woman who had seen the truth he was too afraid to speak. The boy reached out a small, trembling hand toward Tara's sleeve, and the silence of the room finally began to thaw. The memory hit him with the force of a physical blow, dragging Yong-sun away from the gilded silence of the restaurant and back into the past. He was standing in a hospital hallway again, the air tasting of ozone and despair. Bright fluorescent lights burned into his eyes, flickering with a rhythmic hum that sounded like a countdown. The cold white walls were closing in, sterile and indifferent to the weight of his grief. The air was thick with the suffocating smell of antiseptic latex, and the metallic tang of impending death. Around him, the sound of machines beeping, steady, mechanical, and merciless, marked the final seconds of a life he couldn't save. Inside the room, a woman was gripping his hand weakly. Her skin was paper-thin, nearly translucent against the white hospital sheets, and her eyes were already unfocused, looking past him toward a horizon he couldn't follow. This was his wife. The love of his life. She was the only person in a violent, cynical world who had ever made him feel like something other than a weapon to be wielded. "Promise me," she whispered. Her voice was a ghost of its former self, barely a thread of sound, already fading into the hum of the monitors. "Promise you won't raise him alone like this. Promise he'll know love, not just protection. Promise he'll have softness, not just strength." He had promised. In that moment of absolute vulnerability, he had promised everything, anything, the words tumbling from his mouth like desperate prayers to a god he hadn't believed in since childhood. He would have promised to burn the entire world to ash and sift through the ruins if it meant one more minute of her breath. He would have traded every territory, every ledger, and every drop of his own blood just to keep her hand warm. But she had slipped away anyway. He felt the exact moment her grip went slack in his, the warmth retreating from her fingertips like an ebbing tide. Her last breath was so quiet, so unassuming that he almost missed it. And then there was just the silence, a deafening hollow void that filled the room. Then the machines began to scream, a long, flat tone that signaled the end. A nurse touched his shoulder with practiced, clinical sympathy, but he didn't feel it. In another room down the hall, his infant son was crying, and the rest of Yong-sun's life stretched ahead of him like a life sentence in a prison of his own making. He had buried himself in power after that. He sought out control with a religious fervor, finding solace in the only things that made sense in a senseless, cruel world. He built walls of stone and steel around his son Minjun. He kept him safe in a fortress of security, providing him with every luxury, every toy, and every comfort that money could buy. Nannies replaced love. Monthly stipends replaced a father's presence. High-tech security systems replaced the warmth of a mother's hug. He told himself it was enough. It had to be enough. Because in the hollowed-out cavern of his chest, he believed he had nothing else left to give. The memory shattered like glass. Yong-sun was back in the restaurant, back in the present moment, back in a body that suddenly felt far too heavy for the chair he sat in. He blinked, the amber light of the chandeliers returning to focus. The crying had stopped. He looked down at his table. His son was calm, his frantic breathing finally evening out into soft, rhythmic sighs. Minjun's small body was leaning toward Tara like a flower instinctively tilting toward sunlight. He was leaning toward this stranger, this waitress with tired eyes, who had somehow understood in 30 seconds what Yong-sun had failed to grasp in 3 agonizing years. "Stay," Yong-sun said. The words sliced through the room like a sharpened blade. Across the restaurant, servers froze mid-step, their trays trembling. Diners at distant tables forgot to chew, their forks suspended in mid-air. The manager's face went from a nervous flush to a ghostly, translucent white. Tara's heart pounded against her ribs so hard she was certain it would crack the bone. She looked up at the man, her eyes wide with a mix of awe and terror. "I didn't mean to, I should get back to." "Stay," he repeated. This time it wasn't a request. It was a command issued by a man who didn't know how to ask, a man who took what he needed and systematically destroyed anything that dared to stand in his way. But beneath the steel of the command, his voice was soft. It was almost pleading, the sound of a drowning man reaching for a lifeline. Slowly, carefully, as if she were approaching a wounded and unpredictable wild animal, Tara rested her hand on the boy's back. It was just her palm, warm and steady through the fabric of his expensive designer shirt. It was a simple, unfiltered human contact. Minjun leaned into her hand instantly, his body relaxing as if he had been waiting his entire life for exactly this moment. He turned and wrapped his small arms around her neck, burying his tear-stained face in the crook of her shoulder. For the first time since his mother's heart had stopped beating, the boy felt truly safe. Yong-sun watched. The most feared man in the city, the man who carved up territories like a Sunday roast, who moved sums of money that would make a banker dizzy, whose word was the ultimate law and whose anger was a death sentence, sat perfectly still. He watched someone else do for his son what he never could. He watched his son trust a complete stranger. He watched his son find a comfort he was incapable of providing. He watched his son finally stop crying. "What's your name?" Yong-sun asked. His voice was rough, like gravel over silk. "Tara," she managed to whisper. "You have children?" "Yes. A son." She paused, her arms tightening instinctively around Minjun. "He's 7. A silence followed, heavier and more profound than the one before. Yong-sun's dark eyes searched hers, looking for the lie, but finding only the weary truth of a mother. And his father? Gone. The word was flat, final and cold. It held 1,000 stories she would never tell, a history of loss and survival that she wore like a second skin. Yong-sun nodded slowly. He understood more than she had said. He knew the weight of a gone that was permanent. "Sit." It wasn't an invitation. Tara sat, the boy still clinging to her uniform like a barnacle to a ship. The entire restaurant, the elites, the staff, the guards, watched this impossible, surreal scene unfold. A humble waitress holding a crime lord's air while the lord himself watched with an expression of profound, quiet revelation. Minjun pulled back slightly and smiled. It wasn't a small, polite smile for the cameras. It was a real one, wide, genuine, and luminous, transforming his face into something radiant. And in that moment, the restaurant realized something terrifying. Young-sun wasn't angry. He was relieved. The meal continued in a dreamlike, surreal silence. Tara stayed at the table, one arm draped protectively around the boy, occasionally whispering small, comforting things to him. Minjun finally ate his dessert, taking small bites and stealing glances at her between each one, as if he were terrified she might evaporate if he looked away for too long. Young-sun barely touched his own food. He watched them both, his mind working through 1,000 cold calculations, possibilities, and risks. He was a man who planned 10 steps ahead, and he was currently rewriting his entire future. When the check came, though Young-sun never actually paid, as the establishment considered his mere presence a form of protection money, he stood up. The guards, Jiho and Minkyu, straightened immediately, their hands returning to their sides. The manager appeared at the periphery, relief flooding his features that the evening was concluding without a massacre. As they prepared to leave, Young-sun reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. The manager panicked, his hand flying to his chest in a reflexive gesture of fear. Tara tensed, her arm tightening around the boy. Half the patrons in the room held their breath, expecting a weapon. Instead, Young-sun pulled out a business card. It was simple, elegant, made of expensive cardstock with nothing but a single phone number embossed in matte black. No name. No title. Just a direct line to the center of the storm. He placed it on the table in front of Tara. "My number," he said. "I need someone my son trusts." Tara stared at the small rectangle of paper as if it might explode. "I'm just a waitress," she whispered, her voice trembling. Young-sun met her eyes, and for just a fraction of a second, the mask of the underworld king slipped. It was just a moment, but it was enough for her to see the man underneath. The grieving father, the lonely widower, the human being drowning in a sea of blood and responsibility he had never truly wanted. "So was my wife," he said quietly. He turned to the boy, his hand resting gently, almost tentatively, on his son's head. "You want her to come back, Minjun?" The boy nodded immediately, his grip on Tara's uniform tightening. "Then she'll come back," Young-sun said. To anyone else it sounded like a threat. To Tara, it sounded like a promise and a prayer whispered in unison. Weeks later, Tara was no longer balancing trays or dodging the manager's temper. Instead, she was walking a little boy to school in the crisp morning air. Minjun's small hand was tucked firmly in hers, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders with every skip. She laughed at his animated stories about his classmates, listened intently as he described his latest drawings of dragons and spaceships, and answered his endless, curious questions about the world. She had quit the restaurant the very next day. Young-sun had made her an offer that defied logic, not because it was backed by a threat, but because it was generous beyond her wildest dreams. He provided a salary that made her previous life feel like a distant, impoverished memory. He moved her and her son into an apartment in a building so secure it made a government vault look vulnerable. Everything her own son had ever needed, healthcare, education, safety, was suddenly within her reach. All she had to do was be there for a boy who desperately needed a mother's touch. In the beginning it should have felt wrong. It should have felt like she was selling her soul, betraying her independence for the comfort of a criminal's shadow. But every time Minjun looked at her with that pure, uncomplicated trust, every time he reached for her hand in a crowd, all her doubts evaporated. She became the heart of their strange, fractured family. She learned that the boy's full name was Minjun. She learned he loved sliced apples but hated the skin. She learned he was terrified of thunderstorms and loved the smell of rain. She learned that he needed a story every night before bed, and that he missed his mother with a quiet, hollow ache that would never fully heal, but could at least be comforted. And she learned that Young-sun, despite the darkness that defined his public life, loved his son with a ferocity that was almost frightening. But every night, from across the street, from the deep shadows where the streetlights couldn't reach, Young-sun watched. He watched from the back of a black sedan as Tara walked Minjun home from the park, their joined hands swinging as they laughed at some private joke. He watched through the high-security windows as she tucked the boy into bed, reading to him until his eyes drifted closed in genuine peace. He watched her transform his son's world in ways he never could, bringing light into a house that had been a tomb for 3 years. And he watched the other shadows too. He saw the threats before Tara even knew they existed. He noticed the black sedan that circled the block one too many times. He identified the man in the corner coffee shop who never actually looked at his phone. He spotted the photographer with no camera, the jogger, who never broke a sweat. Because Tara didn't know yet, she couldn't possibly know, that by loving his son she had stepped into a world where kindness was seen as a target. She had entered a reality where vulnerability was a weapon to be used by enemies. The moment she became important to Yong-sun, she became the ultimate leverage. His enemies had been watching too. The rival families, the ambitious underlings, the men who had been waiting for years for a single crack in the armor of the untouchable Yong-sun. The moment Yong-sun realized his son had something worth losing, someone worth losing, was the exact moment his enemies decided to take it from him. On the 4th week, Tara finally noticed the car that followed them home from the grocery store. In the 5th week, she found the heavy deadbolt on the apartment door unlocked, though she was certain she had turned the key. In the 6th week, the world finally tilted. Minjun came home from school and pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his backpack. Tara opened it and her blood ran cold. The note was written in elegant script. Such a beautiful family. It would be a shame if something happened to it. She didn't call the police. She didn't call the manager of the building. She called the number on the black business card for the first time since that night at the restaurant. He answered on the first ring. "They found you," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of terrible, inevitable fact. Who? Tara's voice was a jagged edge of fear. "People who want to hurt me by hurting what I love," Yong-sun replied. The phone line went quiet for a long moment, heavy with the weight of that word. Well, it was a confession neither of them was ready to say out loud, yet it hung between them like a physical presence. "What do I do?" Tara asked, her hands shaking as she watched Minjun play with his toy cars on the rug. "You trust me," Yong-sun said, his voice dropping into that tone of absolute, terrifying authority. "And you understand that the moment you walked into my life, you walked into a war." Tara looked at Minjun. He was sleeping peacefully on the couch now, his small chest rising and falling in the quiet room, his face more relaxed than it had ever been. She thought about walking away. She thought about taking her own son and running until they reached a place where Yong-sun's name meant nothing. She thought about the safety of anonymity. But then Minjun stirred in his sleep, murmuring her name and reaching out an unconscious hand, searching for her even in his dreams. Tara closed her eyes. She knew she had already made her choice. She had made it the moment she knelt on a restaurant floor and told a dangerous man the truth. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. Yong-sun's exhale was audible through the phone, a mix of relief, fear and a dark, simmering resolve. "Then neither am I," he said. Across the city, in windowless rooms and back-alley garages, plans were being finalized. Weapons were being cleaned and loaded. Old debts were being called in. Yong-sun had just declared a total war to protect a waitress who had done nothing but show his son a moment of kindness. And in his world, war was the only language that everyone understood. The question wasn't whether blood would be spilled. The question was whose blood would be left when the sun rose.